Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. Chapter 7 moves into a new section of Paul's letter, where he begins to address some things that the Corinthians had previously written to him asking about. In today's chapter, Paul talks a lot about marriage and singleness. This was super necessary for this church because they're people from a Gentile pagan background. Paul is answering the question of what's different about the way that Christians view marriage, divorce, sex, and so on when compared to unbelievers. Overall, Paul is making the point that in whatever circumstance they are in, married, single, divorced, etc., they should seek to be faithful and content. Paul opens by addressing an issue that's happening with married couples in the church. It seems like people have begun to believe that all sex is bad and immoral, even within marriage. Paul stands against this belief and calls them not to withhold themselves from each other. Sex can be done in a sinful way, but marriage is the covenant relationship wherein it is safe, good, and healthy to have sex. Paul also points out to the Corinthians that marriage and singleness are both good places to be. Both of these statuses are gifts from God. Marriage is not better or more holy or more valuable than singleness. Both have advantages over the other in different ways. Paul's saying this as someone who is single. It's possible that he was married at some point, but is now widowed. Either way, he is not married. And this is valuable because sometimes it's annoying to hear married people tell you that singleness is a gift. Because a lot of people are in a season where their singleness is unwanted. And while they can still be grateful for the benefits that being single offers, we also need to acknowledge that unwanted singleness is a difficult trial. Married people, we should pray for and stand with our single friends who aren't content. And single people, ask God to help you see how He wants to use you and how He's growing you. Whether or not you do end up married one day is not a marker of your worth or attractiveness or personality. Paul actually commends singleness as the better option. That's pretty radical for a culture where being single and having no children was seen as a curse. All of us need to remember that our identity is in Christ, not our relationship status. Paul then begins to talk about the topic of divorce. This is a broad and difficult topic, and Paul doesn't comment on every situation that a married couple might face. There are many reasons why people initiate divorces, and a lot of the time there are challenging factors at play. Marriage struggles are something we should navigate alongside trusted people and church leaders. But overall, in this section, Paul is making the point that believers are called to be faithful in their marriages. Marriage is a covenant, not a temporary agreement based on whether we feel in love or not. We are called to be committed to our spouses in hard times as well as easy times. But in general circumstances, Paul calls spouses to be faithful to one another and not to separate from one another. If they do divorce, he also calls them to reconcile and come back together. To those who have come to know Jesus after marriage, Paul says that they shouldn't divorce if their unbelieving spouse doesn't want to. He says that the reason for this is that because of them, their unbelieving spouse will be made holy. What does this mean? He's not saying that people can be saved if their spouses know Jesus. All people have to make that personal decision for themselves. But he is saying that the righteous influence of the believing spouse will impact the unbelieving one. The Christian is not tainted by or harmed by the sin of the non-Christian. Actually, the non-Christian will, in a sense, be set apart from the world by the faith of their spouse. And that in turn means that the unbeliever will be more likely to be saved one day through the faithful witnessing of their spouse. But in the circumstance where the unbeliever does want to divorce, the believer is free to do so. They are free to remarry and be free from hoping in vain for the rest of their lives that their spouse will come to know God as they do. That's a really hard lifestyle to live. And Paul recognizes that there is actually no guarantee that their spouse will respond to their witness, so they are free to divorce and remarry. In all of this talk on divorce and remarriage, remember that Paul is not commenting on every reason why people get divorced. Elsewhere in the Bible, there are different commands and conditions for these situations. If you're interested in this topic, keep looking deeper in the Word and doing more research. It's a difficult topic, and it's important to seek God's wisdom, not the world's. But overall, in general, married believers are called to be faithful and committed to their spouses, being self-sacrificial and loving, even when it isn't easy. Later, Paul begins to write about those who are engaged and those who are widowed. Paul's eternity mindset is very clear in this section. We're living in the last days, waiting for Jesus' return. And Paul makes the point that marriage can come with a lot of distraction from preparing for Jesus' return. It can be harder to be solely focused on God. That's what he means when he says that being single is a blessing. It allows you to be more free and focused on following God, rather than being tied to someone else and worried about them. It's not impossible to be wholly focused on God if you are married. And that doesn't mean that married people shouldn't care for their spouses. But we have to be committed to our spouse and remember that we are living in the last days. All of us, married or unmarried, must live with gospel urgency. The Corinthians were living as if Jesus' return was a long way off. But we have to live as if his return could be at any moment. Paul says that husbands should live as if they don't have a wife, that those who mourn should live as if they are not, and so on. This is a tricky passage, but Paul is not saying to be unfaithful to your spouse or ignore your grief. He's calling them to have an eternal mindset and focus. It's easy to get distracted by all of the things this world has to offer, but we're called to travel light, keep our eyes on Jesus, and give him our all. How does this equip us? You might be reading chapter 7 as someone who has been happily married for decades, has been single for decades, is widowed, is single but doesn't want to be, is single and content, or is married and struggling. Everyone is in a different circumstance. And the emphasis of chapter 7 is that all of us are called to do our best in whatever situation we're in. As the saying goes, we should seek to bloom where we are planted. It's easy to get caught up in desiring to be married, or wishing we married someone else, or regretting the lot we were given in life. But in all things, not just relationships, we have to be faithful with what God's blessed us with. We have to learn to be content. Dissatisfaction, regret, guilt, and vain hope will get us nowhere. Often relationships will be a huge source of pain in our lives, but we all have the ability to choose to do the right thing, even if it's hard, every day. Maybe God has called you to singleness, so you have to resist sexual temptation every day. Maybe God has saved you, but you're married to an unbeliever. Now you have to choose to live righteously and faithfully witness to them every day. Maybe you're widowed, and now you have to navigate following God without someone who's always been with you. Whatever situation you're in, will you trust God? Will you seek him and be obedient to him? Will you choose gratitude and contentment? Let's be people who remain faithful to God even when it's challenging, knowing that he's growing us and blessing us all the way until he returns.